Welcome. Regretfully, David Ferriero, Archivist of the United States, could not be here today to introduce William Marvel, author of Lincoln's Aristocrat, The Life of Edwin Stanton. So on behalf of the archivist, welcome to his house. As a board member of the Abraham Lincoln Institute and a member of a Lincoln book discussion group of the Lincoln Group of the District of Columbia, when I read that William Marvel was going to be speaking here today on his book on the famed Secretary of War of the Lincoln administration, I figuratively penciled in that I was going to come, little thinking that I would actually be privileged to introduce the author. William Marvel has been writing Civil War history since the 1980s. He was born in Virginia and is a longtime New Hampshire resident. He graduated with a BA in history in 1977 from New Hampshire's Keene State College, and in 2001 was awarded Keene's Alumni Achievement Award. His dozen Civil War books include works on Andersonville and Appomattox, and he's written a quartet of year-by-year titles on the war: Mr. Lincoln Goes to War, Lincoln's Darkest Year, the War in 1862, The Great Task Remaining, The Third Year of Lincoln's War, and Tarnished Victory, Finishing Lincoln's War. Bill Marvel holds a prestigious Lincoln Prize from Gettysburg College, as well as the Douglas Southall Freeman Award and the Georgia Historical Society's Bell Award. As for who was Edwin Stanton, Stanton was an esteemed Eastern lawyer who in 1855 humiliated a junior colleague, one Abraham Lincoln. Later, Stanton went on to serve as James Buchanan's Attorney General, Abraham Lincoln's Secretary of War, and Andrew Johnson's too for a while. Grant nominated him to the Supreme Court, but death prevented Stanton from serving. Quite a life. To fill in the details, I give you William Marvel, author of the first significant biography in 50 years on Edwin Stanton.
Thank you, and good afternoon, and thank you for a generous introduction. It's always a great boost to my self-esteem to get out of the town where I grew up and hear myself talked about by people who haven't known me all my life. It's also been good for the spirit to come down and see some green grass. We don't have any yet. In fact, there was still snow in the yard when we left the day before yesterday. It's been a long winter. I've been living with Edwin Stanton for a long time, too, and he has not been a congenial companion. It's been almost 10 years since I started collecting material about him, and I was nearly 4 years writing the biography, not counting about a year and a half of revisions that I couldn't help picking away at while my publisher undertook a perfectly glacial appraisal process. Since I sent them the original manuscript, I wrote 2 other books on local history, and both of them are now in print. They both beat the Stanton biography. And I confess there were times when I was sorry that I had ever heard his name. That put me in company with a lot of other Americans, all now dead, who also wish that they had never heard his name either. I don't live in the academic environment. Most of my days are spent in the town in northern New Hampshire where I grew up, with people with whom I'm far less likely to discuss American history than the superiority of Swedish chainsaws. However, thanks to a very gregarious wife, I tend to meet a lot of new people, often more than seems necessary, and they always want to know what you do, and then they want to know what your latest project is, and they've all been sort of stymied by my reference to Edwin Stanton. None of them really had ever heard of it. And when I tried to explain his role as Lincoln's Secretary of War, I tended to get that glazed over look that I'm sure I was wearing while my daughter was trying to explain to me her article in the November issue of Computer about something called virtualization of home network gateways or something like that. I read it dutifully and I listened attentively and I didn't understand a word. So, for the sake of those people who had never heard of Edwin Stanton, I took to the shorthand of characterizing him as the Dick Cheney of the Lincoln administration. That seemed to get the point across. But, of course, the analogy isn't perfectly accurate because Stanton actually had his defenders and even a few admirers. And I've never met anyone who admired Dick Cheney. It seems kind of strange when you think that he once shot a lawyer. But the comparison between Stanton and Cheney is apt perhaps for more reasons than their equally surly dispositions, their impatience with people whose opinions differ from theirs, and the arrogance that they displayed in positions of public power. Each appears to have served a critically persuasive role in a presidency that oversaw a disturbing degradation of First, Fourth, Fifth, and Sixth Amendment rights in the name of what had by the latter administration come to be called national security. When the legitimacy of such infringements is called into question, as it was in the case of the George W. Bush administration, defenders tend to justify the latest violation by going back through a series of precedents that ultimately take them to the Lincoln administration. Only the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1800 preceded the Lincoln's wartime edicts as an instance of overt repression by the federal government, and surviving antagonism toward that Federalist legislation from 6 decades before the Civil War may help explain why Lincoln's contemporary defenders tended not to cite those acts in justification of his own efforts to curb effective speech. The principal antebellum example of one of his more controversial actions in suspending habeas corpus was that of Andrew Jackson. Not Jackson the president, but Jackson in his role, an autocratic role, as the military commander of a city in which he had declared martial law. Lincoln's initial and rather limited exercise of such presumed authority came before Stanton entered the cabinet in January of 1862, but thereafter Stanton's influence seemed evident in the more constitutionally objectionable actions of federal authorities or in the new congressional legislation that authorized them. So what sort of man was this Stanton? This is a picture of him in the early 1850s with his son, Edwin L. Stanton. The boy was the only surviving child of his first marriage. This was taken 7 or 8 years after the child's mother died. Stanton's last biographer, Harold Hyman, defended him against the aspersions of his more critical associates by claiming that they didn't like him or actually despised him, and so spoke as critically as they could of him in the privacy of their diaries and letters. The notion that they may have disliked him for perfectly good reasons seems not to have occurred to Mr. Hyman, who was unusually generous to Stanton in numerous instances of questionable conduct, and who was also rather supportive in his assessment of executive excesses among wartime presidents in general. Yet while Stanton did have a number of champions among the radical Republicans with whom he last cast his lot, his closer colleagues left a chorus of eerily similar negative observations about him, and I'd like to share with you a good many of them. I hope not too many. Let's begin with Gideon Welles, who was Lincoln's Secretary of the Navy, and he was Secretary of the Navy during Stanton's entire tenure in the War Department. Welles confided in his diary that Stanton was fond of power and its exercise. It was more precious to him than pecuniary gain to dominate over his fellow man. He later observed that Stanton is by nature an intriguer, courts favor, is not faithful in his friendships, is given to secret underhand combinations. Orville Hickman Browning, a senator from Illinois, met Stanton soon after he became Secretary of War and later served with him in the cabinet of Andrew Johnson. And he recorded that he had no faith in him. He has no sincerity of character, Browning wrote, but is hypocritical and malicious. James Buchanan was not the only person to notice Stanton's sycophantic behavior when he occupied subordinate positions. He was always on my side, Buchanan told his niece, and flattered me ad nauseum. Andrew Johnson expressed the same impression in 1867. Johnson's personal secretary noted in his diary that in speaking of Mr. Stanton, he, Johnson, often referred to his duplicity. He did not know any man who could be more obsequious than Mr. Stanton when he pleased. There was, too, he said, a good deal of Robespierre in Mr. Stanton. Edward Bates, who spent nearly 3 years with Stanton in Lincoln's cabinet, afterward wrote that Stanton believes in mere force so long as he wields it, but cowers before it when wielded by any other hand. Jacob Thompson, who served in Buchanan's cabinet with Stanton, confided to another of their colleagues in the administration that I know no man who has reached eminence in America or anywhere else who has made for himself so execrable a character and who deserves so well the contempt of all good and true men. Finally, Ulysses Grant, for whom I hope I don't need an image, tended to soften his vocabulary when he was criticizing others, but he said of Stanton that he cared nothing for the feelings of others. In fact, it seemed to be pleasanter to him to disappoint than to gratify. He felt no hesitation in assuming the functions of the executive or in acting without advising him. Insofar as military matters were concerned, Grant was much more complimentary to Lincoln than to Stanton. He noted that Lincoln was not timid, but was willing to trust his generals in making and executing their plans. Well, actually, Lincoln did sometimes interfere in troop dispositions, especially during George McClellan's tenure at the head of the Army, but Stanton's own personal campaign to destroy McClellan figured prominently in those instances of micromanagement. Grant probably was aware of those intrigues through their common friends, in addition to remembering his own experiences with Stanton, when he wrote that the secretary was very timid. It was impossible for him to avoid interfering with the armies. He could see our weakness, but he could not see that the enemy was in danger. The enemy would not have been in danger if Mr. Stanton had been in the field. Well, did all those men conspire to leave disparaging impressions of Stanton for the historians to find when they started mining the manuscripts? I really don't think so. They all acted independently, too. All of them had put their opinions on paper privately and before Grant published his own memoirs, and he had no access to their impressions. He was writing from his own direct observations and personal experience with Stanton, as they were. With the exception of those numerous radical Republicans I mentioned with whom Stanton never found adequate reason to betray, Stanton's associates appear to have recorded mainly scathing indictments of his habit of personal and political treachery and his seemingly pathological capacity for double dealing. Even Judge Advocate General Joseph Holt, with whom Stanton remained in what I would call close cahootnership until he left Johnson's cabinet, implicitly accused Stanton of infidelity to him, although in that case Holt was trying to rescue his own reputation from allegations of skullduggery that carried more than a little aroma of truth. Until he was confirmed as Secretary of War, Stanton pretended to be the best friend of General George McClellan. That would be him on the left. He was the General-in-Chief of the U.S. Army at the time that McClellan took over, as well as the commander of the army around Washington. But Stanton's devotion to him seemed only to last so long as Stanton felt he needed an enthusiastic endorsement from McClellan in order to cover all his bases in getting the nomination from the president. On his first day in the War Department, Stanton arranged a meeting with McClellan's worst enemies, the most powerful and combative of the radical Republicans, who were rapidly gaining political momentum and were turning nearly as antagonistic toward the president as were the more oppositional Democrats. They included Ben Wade, the chairman of the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War, Zachariah Chandler, another member of the Committee on the Conduct of the War. And that first evening of his career as Secretary of War, Stanton called Wade, Chandler, and the Joint Committee into his office. No minutes of that meeting were taken, but messages that passed between Wade and Stanton the next day indicated that their initial discussions had already touched on the subject of removing McClellan as commander of the nation's armies. The radicals despised McClellan as a Democrat who was soft on slavery, and once Stanton had secured confirmation, he no longer needed the general. Gauging the relative importance to his future of McClellan and the radicals, Stanton undertook a clandestine campaign to reduce McClellan's role and influence and ultimately to remove him altogether by whatever means were needed. As any close student of the military history of the war knows, McClellan had his own failings, the worst of which probably was his deadly tendency toward hesitation when what was needed most was bold action. But considering how early McClellan detected Stanton's abrupt hostility, I'm not sure we'll ever know to what degree the general's timid behavior on the battlefield was based on his justifiable fear that his immediate superior in the War Department would use whatever disaster befell his army as a means of eliminating him. In fact, Stanton did take preliminary steps, asking ominous leading questions toward having McClellan court-martialed, just as he did later court-martial McClellan's best friend, Fitzjohn Porter, and for offenses that might have carried the death penalty. Porter's career was unfairly destroyed, and Stanton would have done the same to McClellan, especially if he could have avoided the responsibility for it by finding someone else to press the charges, as he did in the case of Porter. The first indication of how far Stanton would go to gratify his new radical friends came with the arrest of Brigadier General Charles P. Stone, a talented and conscientious soldier who had eradicated disloyal sentiment in the District of Columbia militia during the secession crisis. Like McClellan, Stone was a Democrat, and he observed the laws regarding runaway slaves in the loyal state of Maryland, and he returned them to loyal owners or owners who claimed to be loyal. Well, that was enough to make him anathema among radical Republicans, and Massachusetts Senator Charles Sumner insulted Stone for it on the floor of the Senate. Stone responded with a private note calling Sumner a well-known coward in reference to the beating he took on the floor of the Senate in 1856 without defending himself or avenging himself. Stanton, who had been secretly colluding with Sumner since his first days in James Buchanan's cabinet, pleased both Sumner and Wade in particular, and the radicals in general, by having Stone arrested and placed in Fort Lafayette in New York Harbor. And there that general remained for 6 more months without any charges filed against him, and therefore no trial. Ultimately, it took an act of Congress to force Stanton to release Stone, and he waited until the last possible day specified in that congressional bill. Then, once Stone had been released, Stanton refused to assign him to refused to assign him to another command. When General Grant tried to use Stone later in the war, Grant at that time was the commander of all the U.S. armies, Stanton had Stone mustered out of his volunteer rank of brigadier general, and therefore reduced him to his regular army rank of colonel and limited the importance of any role he might have played, so Stone ultimately resigned in frustration. Well, that wasn't the worst example of Stanton's unjust and spiteful nature, but it was one of the most conspicuous and best remembered, and it reflects negatively on Lincoln, to whom Stone appealed in vain for some word of vindication. Lincoln's half-finished reply to Stone's request indicates that he appears to have been aware of the injustice, but although it was an egregious wrong that he could have quickly righted, Lincoln evidently preferred to let it stand rather than to seem to criticize Stanton or bring into question the arbitrary arrests he had allowed Stanton to exercise so broadly. Within weeks of taking over the War Department, Stanton methodically and quietly consolidated as much of the executive branch power in his own hands as he dared. First, he persuaded the president to relieve Secretary of State William Seward, now, of the authority to make extraordinary arrests. That is, arrests without due process, often without evidence, and to transfer that power to Stanton. Then, as the Army was about to take the field, he removed the telegraph lines and all the equipment from Army headquarters in Washington and installed it in the War Department next to his own office. So McClellan could not communicate with anyone in the government, and probably the president more than anyone, without going through Stanton. That allowed him to control McClellan's communications and that of everyone beneath him. Stanton also took military possession of the nation's telegraph lines, which enabled him to exert considerable control over the news. He telegraphed the major newspapers what first appeared to be a mere suggestion that they should not report on the movements of the Army, but he soon started calling that suggestion an order. His motive lay more in propaganda, though, than security, for he enforced that dictum with a partisan bias that left supportive newspapers like the New York Times perfectly immune. In his recent book on Lincoln in the Press, for which I have to congratulate him on tomorrow night's Lincoln Prize, I hope that's not revealing any secret, Harold Holzer portrayed Stanton as an equal opportunity censor who would shut down a Lincoln-friendly newspaper as quickly as he would one of rabid Democratic sentiments. In support of that claim, Mr. Holzer cited Stanton's first such action, with which he evidently intended to establish a quick precedent without risk of a challenge. On March 17, 1862, at the outset of the Peninsula Campaign, Stanton directed the commander of Washington's defenses to arrest the printers and publishers of the Washington Sunday Chronicle for revealing the composition and movements of the Army of the Potomac, which was then moving down to Fort Monroe and coming up the peninsula. If the story about that incident in the Philadelphia Press is true, and the press was owned by the same man who owned the Chronicle, the editor was taken into custody but was released as soon as he apologized and swore that it would never happen again. Mr. Holzer commented that the War Department then allowed the War Department to resume publication after a day of rare silence, but there was no day of rare silence. As its name indicates, the Washington Sunday Chronicle was then a weekly, published on Sunday, and this affair was taken care of by Monday or Tuesday. So the paper was back in operation in plenty of time for the next edition. The incident did no harm to the Chronicle and did indeed make Stanton look very nonpartisan. The owner of the Chronicle and the press was John Forney, who was as close a crony of the administration as there was in the American press. He may have tacitly participated in what was essentially a drama orchestrated to intimidate other editors, and particularly opposition editors. Thereafter, Stanton confined the exercise of his presumed power to shut down newspapers almost exclusively to the opposition press, while friendlier publications revealed militarily damaging information with little or no consequence. Robert E. Lee said his plans for the Gettysburg campaign were based on intelligence he gathered from the Philadelphia Inquirer, a newspaper that was also very supportive of the Lincoln administration and suffered no repercussion for regular transgressions of that nature. Neither did the New York Times, which revealed General Sherman's plans for his march to the sea just as he stepped off from Atlanta. General Grant complained about that specifically to Stanton, and Stanton essentially blew it off as the fault of Sherman's own talkative staff officers. Reporters who wanted ready access to the armies learned that they were better off to avoid topics that reflected badly on the administration, and especially those that might embarrass Mr. Stanton and his War Department. The same lesson applied to their editors. As the press often finds today, at least in small or corrupt environments where the authorities can still get away with it, media credibility can be severely compromised by being shut off from official information. Only 6 weeks after he assumed his duties in the War Department, in what may have been his most devastating blow to the Union war effort, Stanton decided entirely on his own, and apparently without even consulting the president, to close down all the recruiting stations. At that same juncture, the Confederate government was just imposing conscription on its population. So the spring campaigns began with the Confederate armies expanding and the Union forces shrinking. That deprived Union commanders of some of the overwhelming force that might have helped them to crush the rebellion a little more quickly. And by midsummer, both the major Union armies in the Eastern and Western Theater were on the defensive, essentially on the retreat. President Lincoln and Secretary Seward, again, went to unusual lengths to save the administration embarrassment by disguising the magnitude of Stanton's blunder, to the point of staging a charade in which the state governors pretended to offer troops to the federal government on their own initiative without a proclamation demanding it. Even as the Presidents Seward and Stanton were orchestrating that deceptive pantomime, Senator Henry Wilson of Massachusetts, rather goggle-eyed fellow, and the chairman of the Military Affairs Committee, was shepherding legislation through Congress, extending executive authority to call out the militia. It was ostensibly a militia bill, but it was really the nation's first national, federally administered conscription law, and Lincoln signed it on July 17th. The language of the bill, the precautionary details of it, and Stanton's close collaboration with Wilson on later military legislation suggests that Stanton's hand was heavily involved in the composition of that legislation. Less than 3 weeks later, Stanton used that law as his authority to call out 300,000 nine-month militia, in addition to the 300,000 three-year volunteers that the governors had purportedly offered. Then, in conjunction with that draft, he issued another order on his own initiative To arrest and imprison any person or persons who may be engaged by act, speech, or writing in discouraging volunteer enlistments, or in any way giving aid and comfort to the enemy, or in any other disloyal practice against the United States. With his inclusion of the deliberately vague reference to discouraging volunteer enlistments, and especially by inserting the word speech or writing in that order, Stanton unilaterally extended the constitutional definition of treason and even the dubious new congressional interpretation of it to include the voicing of opinions contrary to executive policy. To be certain that such dissidents were not released by quibbling over annoying legal details, he added that any prisoners taken under his order should be held for trial before military commissions. Critical newspaper editors, Democrats running for state office and congressional seats, and dissident citizens by the hundreds, including many discharged soldiers, officers, and enlisted men alike, were rounded up under this order, which required only the affidavits of 2 persons who claimed to have heard disloyal sentiments expressed. In Iowa, citizens were denounced under this order for being very saucy to federal marshals or state officials, or for laughing at the drill practice of amateur militiamen. Among the newspaper editors arrested and dragged off to Washington was Dennis Mahoney of the Dubuque Herald, who had complained too often that the burden of military service fell disproportionately on immigrant Irishmen without a draft, and that it would only be worse with one. In New Hampshire, an elderly doctor was locked in a damp cell in a coastal fort for 2 months because he interrupted a recruiting rally to declare that the volunteers were more interested in bounty money than in their country. And he added as well that nothing awaited them but death and damnation. So, of course, he had to go to jail. For the first time since 1800, and only for the second time in American history, the federal government actively imprisoned people for the opinions they expressed. To give his order the appearance of greater legitimacy and perhaps to relieve himself of personal liability in case of lawsuits for false arrest, Stanton asked the president to reissue the order under his own presumed war powers and to make it last for the duration of the war, suspending habeas corpus for the assorted crimes that Stanton had enumerated and subjecting the accused to the rigors of martial law. I'm afraid we're going to have to look at Senator Wilson for a long time. In the increasingly eulogistic atmosphere that infects some corners of Lincoln scholarship, it can be downright risky to one's reputation to offer any especially new criticism of his administration or to resurrect old criticism. Even historians who recognize what Mark Neely called the low tide of liberty following Stanton's 1862 order tend to handle the subject with kid gloves. Since fewer than 20,000 people appear to have been arrested by the administration under these orders, and no one really knows how many there were, it's usually presumed that Stanton's authority was employed rather judiciously. But the United States population now is about 10 times what it was in 1862, maybe a little more. And a proportionate crackdown would sweep up 200,000 people over the course of 4 years. Well, how chilling an effect might the arbitrary arrest and the indefinite detention of 200,000 American citizens today have on the expression of political opinion? Worse yet, in terms of the precedents set by the Lincoln administration, mostly through Stanton, even those scholars who find all those arrests the least pernicious concede that most of them were probably not even necessary. Anyone who doubts how influential Stanton's declarations and practices have been on the exercise of liberty in the United States might consider his 2-part order of August 8, 1862, the one ordering the arrest and indefinite detention by military authority without appeal to habeas corpus of anyone who, by act, speech, or writing, seemed to be giving aid and comfort to the enemy. Sections 1021 and 1022 of the National Defense Authorization Act of 2012 essentially reiterate the two halves of that order. They could have been written by someone looking at Stanton's order in the official records. Section 1021 authorizes the arrest and indefinite confinement without benefit of habeas corpus for anyone suspected under the catch-all category of terrorism or of aiding, harboring, or supporting such terrorists, while the second section, 1022, prescribes, as did the second part of Stanton's order, that they should be confined and tried by military authorities. Those provisions conflict directly with the Fourth, Fifth, and Sixth Amendments, and if they were interpreted as loosely as Stanton did his own orders, they could also be used to subvert the First Amendment. They haven't been challenged yet, I might add. It's a chilling vision for the future, especially when, as Stanton's contemporaries found, anyone might suddenly find himself subject to such an accusation. Almost any of us might have two enemies willing to file an affidavit claiming they heard us say something. Certainly I do. The revisions to the militia law, for most of which Stanton had probably offered Senator Wilson his own language, included enabling legislation for the new position of Judge Advocate General. And for that position, he appears to have had a candidate already in mind, and that candidate was his own former colleague in the Buchanan administration, Joseph Holt. He called Holt into the War Department one day in early September for a chat, and the next day the president issued Holt his commission as Judge Advocate General, which he held the rest of his working life until late in the Grant administration. Like Stanton, Holt had become dependent on the emoluments of public office. And like Stanton, he had reversed his political tack when the wind turned against the democratic machine on which he had relied. Converts tend to be the most virulent advocates of their new creeds, perhaps primarily because they feel the need to dispel any doubts about their sincerity, and in that zeal, Holt followed Stanton's lead. They worked closely together for the next 6 years, with Holt holding the authority to approve or disapprove the findings of military commissions, and thus offering the semblance of an appeals process. In reality, Holt usually exercised that authority as partisan politics or Stanton's own implied wishes dictated, as he did in the courts-martial of Fitzjohn Porter and Surgeon General William Hammond. Holt also cooperated with Stanton in continuing the tactic of trying prisoners before military commissions long after peace had been restored, the better to control the outcomes of trials and to impart political punishment where civil courts would have dismissed the charges for lack of evidence or even for lack of a crime. Students of political repression under the Lincoln administration, and particularly repression of the press, will often discount its severity by pointing out some of the venomous editorial comment to which Lincoln was subjected in the opposition newspapers. And there was plenty of it. But the acrimony of such rebuke was of less concern to Lincoln or the administration than was the effectiveness of that criticism. Pundits like Dennis Mahoney, who seems to have been as persuasive as he was incisive, posed much more of a danger than a small-town editor whose invective echoed in a relative vacuum. The tone of dissent tended to soften, too, with the severity of periodic crackdowns, which often fell at critical political junctures. Stanton's original 1862 order, for instance, and the president's reiteration of it, preceded the biennial elections of that year, in which Republicans were expected to do very badly, and did, but might have done even worse were it not for such intimidating orders. Samuel Maderi, the editor of the acerbically independent Crisis of Columbus, Ohio, was not molested during the gubernatorial election of 1863 because no one was worried about that. Union battlefield successes and vigorous propaganda gave Ohio Republicans the greatest majority, landslide victory, the greatest majority of any state in the war, any election in the war. But with the presidential campaign of 1864 just beginning and very much in doubt, Maderi was arrested and his editorial voice was silenced. Not many such arrests were necessary either to initiate an epidemic of considerable self-censorship, and not many students have looked at that self-censorship very closely. I will jump ahead a little here and say that Stanton betrayed all three of the presidents he served. As Attorney General under Buchanan, he ingratiated himself to the incoming Lincoln administration by carrying embellished tales of confidential cabinet discussions to Seward, who then passed them on to Lincoln. Once installed as Lincoln's Secretary of War, he immediately and secretly allied himself with Lincoln's critics among the radicals. And when Chase allowed himself to be considered as a challenger to Lincoln in the 1864 election, Stanton played both sides of the fence. He gave Chase's editorial supporters War Department advertising, and he also met secretly with Henry Winter Davis, a radical and co-author of the Wade-Davis Manifesto that posed a significant challenge to Lincoln's presidency. I think I will wrap up here. Let me see. We've already discussed Mr. Chase. Let me conclude by saying that I can't tell you Stanton was without redeeming qualities. I can tell you that direct evidence of such qualities is difficult to find. They're more easily inferred than proved. He was good to his mother, and I'm pretty sure he never beat his wife. But in the realm of public service, his motives seemed more often selfish than benevolent, and his actions were more often pernicious than beneficial. He cowed opposition to the Lincoln administration, probably not enough to make a difference in the final outcome of the war, but certainly enough to leave us with a greater legacy of wartime repression than is comfortable today, or was necessary then. And with that, I think I'll close and give you an opportunity to ask questions. I understand that there will be microphones going around. It seems to be my fate to answer questions about subjects that I have long since abandoned in favor of others. But if you happen to get the advantage of me that way, and I don't know the answer to your questions, I'll try to make up something that's plausible and entertaining. Thanks. Are those the microphones that I understand the questions are coming from? They're in the aisles. Very good. Yes, sir.
Okay. I wonder if I might get in two questions for the price of one. First of all, short one. Where are the Stanton papers?
They are in the Library of Congress, and they are in the second drawer of my file cabinet. They're on microfilm, and they can be had different places if you have about $1,400 to throw away.
Oh.
That one's free.
Okay. And just to clarify, you mentioned Jacob Thompson among the Stanton critics.
Yes.
Was this the same man who was
Yes.
He was?
He was.
Associated with Confederates?
Yes.
Or
He was a
sympathizers?
Confederate minister of sorts, with portfolio, I guess, but secret portfolio in Canada. He was a member of the Buchanan cabinet and remained a member of it until he suspected Buchanan of secretly breaking a promise to him to forewarn him of any change in his policy toward Fort Sumter.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Since I focus on medical aspects of the period,
Yes.
there's one guy who probably would like Stanton a lot, and that was General Dan Sickles, who, even though his biography is called American Scoundrel, when he murdered his wife in Lafayette Park, I'm sorry, his wife's lover, who was the son of Francis Scott Key, it was none other than Edwin Stanton who got him off on the temporary insanity defense. Or at least he headed the legal team.
Well, that's the legend. Actually, Stanton was part, oh, by the way, American Scoundrel, I think, was a well-deserved title. Stanton was a member of the legal team. He was one of 8 lawyers.
It was the dream team of the day.
Excuse me?
It was the dream team. It was like OJ.
Yes, and very similar circumstances. And Stanton was not, I think, the person who came up with the insanity defense. Not only that, it was not, as is often alleged, the first instance of the use of that particular defense. In fact, it had been used in the same courtroom 1 year before. But I think it was James Brady who came up with that idea, because in his own harangue to the jury, Stanton ranged so widely away from the insanity defense that he sort of cast some doubt on it. It was just that he was a member of that team that has led him to be.
And the other thing you mentioned briefly was the court-martial of William Hammond, which Stanton was at least complicit in, where they trumped up. He tried to get rid of poisonous drugs, and they court-martialed him. And Stanton certainly probably had something to do with that, because the guy who replaced him, Joseph Barnes, was not only a friend of Stanton, probably I think he was his personal physician as well. Barnes was, just in a recent book, criticized for the guy who assured Lincoln was going to die that night by sticking a bullet probe into his brain in the Peterson house. So there's all kinds of...
Did this come up during Harold Holzer's?
It certainly did.
Not Harold Holzer. Yes, I saw that there was another program of that type. Yes, Hammond was.
That's Mr. Abel's book.
Right, Hammond got rid of, or was getting rid of, things like calomel and other mercury-laced medicines that were doing more harm than good. And when Stanton had him court-martialed and replaced him with Barnes, what he did was essentially reinstitute the use of those harmful medicines for the next 20 years. Are there any more questions? Sir, do we have time for one more? Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay, in the 1930s, Otto Eisenschimel built a circumstantial case for some complicity in Lincoln's assassination by Stanton. Is that too far, even for Stanton, or what do you think of that?
That is too far for Stanton. Whatever Eisenschimel's research may have been, and however much of it Bill O'Reilly used, it was sheer poppycock. Lincoln was Stanton's principal defender in the administration. He was the most powerful advocate of Stanton's continued incumbency, which was the most important thing to Edwin Stanton. He had no reason to want Lincoln dead. However, as I indicated, he had such a reputation for sly and treacherous behavior that it was perfectly plausible to Eisenschimmel and to others that Stanton might have had a hand in it, but it's preposterous. Sir?
Yes, first a footnote. You note that David Davis and Stanton were classmates at Kenyon College. The footnote is that David Davis bought the nomination for Lincoln in Chicago, which even Doris Kearns Goodwin admits was a bought nomination. Whether Stanton knew it was bought by his classmate, I don't know. I looked in your book for any mention of the Emancipation Proclamation, and McClellan's position on that was quite clear. He was opposed because he loved Southern cadets at West Point. He was very biased in favor of the South and didn't really want to make the end of slavery a war objective, and he actually gave Lincoln his middle finger at the Harrison Landing. I think the split between Stanton and McClellan, who may be your hero, was inevitable from the beginning when, although I think it's true that Stanton, they were friends originally in 1861, but there's no question Stanton wanted to force out McClellan, and Lincoln came to the same conclusion.
Is there a question in there?
Yeah, the question is here, you don't really give a balanced picture of McClellan and the Stanton relationship, I don't think, in the book.
I think Stephen Sears did a pretty good job of balancing McClellan's image, and although McClellan, and by the way, Steve would probably object to your characterization of McClellan as my hero. I think it's a mistake to assume that because someone doesn't specifically criticize a character for any of numerous motivational variations that they're a supporter of that person. I think that McClellan's opposition to the Emancipation Proclamation probably was similar to that of many other mainstream Democrats, much like during the recent conflicts when we have gone to war and for a supposed purpose, many people doubt the motive, and I think McClellan doubted the motive. Do we have a time for another question? Yes, sir.
Hi, Carl Gollivan. Brigadier General Thomas Harris and Lincoln confidant Charles Chiniquy both wrote with great conviction of their belief that the assassination conspiracy extended into the hierarchy of both the Vatican and its Jesuit military order. It's been said that Stanton shared that perspective, and I want to ask, in his papers, did you find any indication of that?
None, and I will give you the same opinion of it that Harold Holzer did. I think it's not. I think it's not plausible. Any others? I think we are finished then. Thank you very much.
Folks, there is a book signing one level up in the Archives bookstore. We'll see you up there in just a few minutes.